The election season is upon us in Louisiana, and as always, there are some intriguing storylines to cover. Therefore, we wanted to check in with two of LSU's resident political experts to talk a little bit about history, trends, and some of the current colorful figures in local and national politics. So we're here with Wayne Parent, Russell B. Long Professor in the Department of Political Science, who specializes in Southern and Louisiana politics, and Bob Mann, Manship Chair and Professor/Senior Fellow at the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs. Wayne, we'll start with you. After signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, President Johnson reportedly told an aide, "We," meaning the Democratic Party, "have lost the South for an entire generation." Now, that kind of seems like a little bit of an underestimation in his part. How much of a lock does the GOP have on the South, and are Democrats looking like a permanent minority party in this region?
Well, the Republicans don't have a lock on the South as much as the Democrats had it before the Civil Rights Movement. Before the Civil Rights Movement, the Democrats had a really strong lock on the South. After the signing of civil rights, the sort of black-white dynamic played out, and Republicans started to do really well. And then other issues, social issues, came in. Republicans do well in the South, and it's the only place other than a few states in the Great Plains where Republicans are always favored, but Democrats have won a lot of elections. Louisiana, Bill Clinton won a couple of elections. Senator Landrieu, a Democrat, won last year. So Democrats remain competitive, but certainly now LBJ's prediction was fairly correct that Republicans are generally favored in most elections in the South.
Why do either of you think that Louisiana might have been a little late to the game, so to speak, as far as trending a little bit more conservative than other states in the South?
Well, Catholics in Louisiana had been swing voters. North Louisiana is much like Mississippi and Alabama, and started voting very conservative Republican after the Civil Rights Act and the like, with African Americans voting Democratic. Catholics in South Louisiana were swing voters, and Louisiana would go back and forth. Now Catholics are voting much more Republican, and that's only happened in the last decade, and it's due to issues like abortion and gay rights, where Catholics have become very conservative and voting on those issues. So Louisiana is voting much more in line with Mississippi and Alabama now than it did a decade ago when, for instance, Bill Clinton carried Louisiana easily, and George Bush was getting his biggest numbers in Mississippi and Alabama.
And what's been your experience, Bob, as far as this trend?
Well, I think that what Wayne has said is absolutely correct, but I also think there's some aberrations, for lack of a better word. For example, take Mary Landrieu. It would be easy and accurate to say the Democrats can still compete in Louisiana, but you also have to look at the individual races that Senator Landrieu has won. One of the reasons why she's still in the U.S. Senate is not because she's a great senator, which I think she is, not because she's a good campaigner, which I think she is, but because she has always seemed to have had the luck of getting the worst possible Republican to run against her. She's been very fortunate to have Republican candidates who weren't nearly as good at campaigning or had problems that held them back. With better opposition, she might not be there now, but she is. And I think that, so, Tip O'Neill is famous for saying all politics are local, and sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not. But in Mary Landrieu's case, for example, I think it is true in a sense. When Kathleen Blanco beat Bobby Jindal in 2003, I think it was simply because Jindal ran an awful campaign and Blanco ran a much better campaign. Having been involved in that campaign, it's maybe a bit of bragging, but I think we ran a better campaign. 4 years later, Jindal ran a very good campaign against very lackluster Democratic opposition. So sometimes it has to do with generational trends, like LBJ saying we signed away the South for a generation, but often it's just that one candidate's a lot better than the other.
But it's safe to say, go ahead.
Well, and in Louisiana, partisan politics haven't been quite as strong. I mean, and one of the reasons for that is our absence of party primaries. People don't feel quite as loyal to parties as Mississippi and Alabama. And Mississippi and Alabama should be the comparison points. I mean, they're demographically quite a bit like Louisiana. Again, Cajun, South Louisiana, New Orleans make Louisiana a little different than those states. But if you look at Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, you see one difference where politics would be local and party politics wouldn't be quite as important, is our lack of party primaries since the 1970s. And I think that does help a Mary Landrieu and other Democrats in Republican years and Republicans in Democratic years, where Louisiana isn't quite as partisan, not quite as partisan as states that surround us.
Have you guys seen any trend of African Americans in New Orleans coming back post-Katrina these days? Is that affecting anything for this political cycle, this election cycle?
Well, I think we're not going to know for sure until we see the election returns, and more importantly, until we see the census returns from Louisiana. So we don't really know. There's the Democratic Party, particularly the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor Fayard and Charlie Melanson, are putting a lot of time and effort into turning that African American vote in Orleans Parish, turning it out, and we'll see soon enough. But I think it is down from what it was. I think it's clearly down from what it was 5-10 years ago. It's come back some, but and maybe it's come back enough to help a Cedric Richmond get elected to Congress. It may not have come back enough to help a Charlie Melanson get elected to the Senate.
Well, speaking of Melanson, David Vitter has had his own kind of travails as of late. What do you guys see as the reason why the public might not be as predisposed to, turn on a David Vitter because of his self-professed sins, quote unquote, as they were to turn on a Bill Clinton?
Well, this is a great year for him to run. I mean, if you're a Republican incumbent, you want to run 2 years after a Democrat's been elected president and the economy's down. This is a tailor-made year for Republicans, and even though this state might not be that partisan, he's got the R by his name, and he very strongly identifies himself with the Republican Party. So it's a really good year for him to run as a Republican, and he's fortunate that this is the year. This is the first election after the revelations came out about his sins. Again, I mean, the race is not over, but he's a clear favorite because it seems to be a Republican year. The race is probably more competitive because of those things than it might have been. An incumbent Republican in the South where John McCain won with big numbers, you would think you wouldn't even look at this race, but people see this race as a race that, while Senator Vitter's strongly favored, it's still a race where there's some competition, and they're certainly running ads, and it could be one of those surprise races. You always have one or two in an election year.
Bob, are both candidates doing the right thing? Is Melanson doing the right thing for hitting Vitter on his proclivities, and is Vitter doing the right thing for trying to avoid debates until the last minute?
Yeah, I think they're both doing what they need to do. I think Vitter's done what he needs to do more effectively. Vitter recognized very early on, I think, as early as 2 years ago, that when he was running for re-election in the fall of 2010, that this race was either going to be a referendum on him or it was going to be a referendum on Barack Obama. And if it's a referendum on David Vitter loses. He doesn't want it to be a referendum on him. Charlie Melancon's tried to make it a referendum on him. The problem is that Vitter started about a year early, making it a referendum on Barack Obama. He established himself as the most vociferous, determined opponent of Barack Obama in Louisiana from day one, and has done a very good job, I think, of casting this election, this struggle for how to frame the debate. Are people going to the polls in November to vote about whether it should be David Vitter or Charlie Melanson, or has Vitter done a good job of harnessing the anger, the frustration, the animosity that a lot of voters have toward Obama, and encouraging them and helping them channel it toward Melanson? Go to if you don't like Obama, you can express your displeasure by voting against Charlie Melanson, and that's the way that this debate, I think, has been framed. And Vitter's done a very effective job, and Melanson's had a hard time changing that frame back to a referendum on Vitter.
On a scale of 1 to 10, what do policy decisions mean in this particular race?
By policy decisions, you mean votes in the past?
Votes in the past.
6 or 7, depending on how they're framed in the campaign. But there are only 3 or 4 that depend on, that are high profile enough. It depends on how they're hit. Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that policy is important to some extent, but I think it's mostly important to the extent that it helps interpret your personality and your style.
Like a character-driven race.
And I think most races are. I mean, I think most voters don't sit down with a list and say, okay, on 6 out of the 10 issues, I agree with Vitter, so 6-4 wins, I'm voting for Vitter, as opposed to the other way around. That's not how they do it. It's more of a comfort factor. Do I feel comfortable with this person? Do I think that he or she shares my values? Do I just have a feeling that this person would represent me well? And issues do help make up that comfort factor, but it's not as clinical and pro-con as you might think it. It's more like, I always describe it to my students, about how you decide to get married. You don't say, okay, well, my girlfriend here, let's see, what are the pros and cons of marrying her? Well, oops, so by 5 to 6 she wins, so I'll ask her to marry me. That's not how people decide how to get married. That's not how people decide who to vote for.
Gotcha. Speaking of emotions, the Tea Party is a big topic of discussion now in the media. Is the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party helping or hurting them in the short and long terms? And do you see any fractioning off of the Democratic Party maybe after the November elections to create maybe a liberal wing of that party?
I see some help in the short term, probably a lot less help in the long term. Some help in motivation. You read polls right now. The Senate race in Illinois is nip and tuck if Democrats don't go out to vote. If Democrats go out to vote, Barack Obama's successor will clearly be a Democrat, but it's nip and tuck now because Democrats aren't motivated to vote. It's all about motivation, and Tea Party is clearly helping to motivate the Republican Party. The downside, though, is the Tea Party motivates the Republican Party in ways that a lot of mainstream Republicans don't like. You can see some very concrete examples. Delaware was going to be a sure switch from Democrat to Republican. Republicans had a moderate candidate that was going to win in Delaware. Kentucky, a state that's voted very Republican in the last several cycles. You would certainly think a Republican would win in this very Republican cycle. The Tea Party supported a candidate in Rand Paul that all of a sudden that's a race that Republicans are worried about. It's a 50-50 race. So there are a few isolated instances where Republicans have clearly hurt themselves by the Tea Party being there. But in an election like this, where a midterm election, so much depends on turnout. If Democrats turned out at the same levels as Republicans, we wouldn't be talking about a wave or anything like that. Republicans would gain, but not nearly as much. And that's why in these kinds of years, the out party doesn't do very well. And the Tea Party has served to motivate. In the future, if you start seeing, a perfect example again would be Sarah Palin. If Sarah Palin becomes the Republican nominee, a Tea Party candidate, that would hurt the Republican Party. I mean, I think most people would acknowledge that. And so right now, I think on balance, they're probably a plus in motivating the party, but there are some definite negatives that go along.
And Bob, what would you tell a candidate if there was a tape that surfaced and the candidate was proclaiming to have been a witch at one point? How would you combat that?
I don't think that I would advise them to cut a commercial that says, "I am not a witch," no more than I would have advised Richard Nixon to go out in a press conference and say, "I am not a crook." I think it's not a very smart thing to repeat the charge and remind people that, hey, there are some people who are saying that I'm a witch. I don't think
those people are wacky.
Yeah, exactly. and then to follow it up by saying I'm one of you, because we've all dabbled in witchcraft. I just don't think that was a very smart thing. But O'Donnell is more of a joke than a legitimate candidate. I think it's really, honestly, I think it's kind of shameful how much the media is focusing on her, because she doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning this election. But if I were a legitimate Republican candidate, I would cringe. I would want the media to ignore that woman as much as possible, because to the extent that she characterizes what the Tea Party is about, it's not good for Republicans across the country.
Well, and a great example, if Republicans have a stronger than expected, people are expecting a strong November 2nd, but if even stronger than expected and win a lot of these really close Senate races, she might be the reason they don't capture the Senate if it's down to one race. And that was a sure bet for Republicans. Now it's a sure bet for the Democrats.
Well, speaking of the media and what they decide to and not to cover, what do you think about is there a declining level of political discourse, or is it just the echo chamber that's gotten louder? I mean, people so shortly forget Hamilton and Burr, who dueled it out after being called names. But is it an echo chamber, or are people not paying attention to things like policy anymore?
I don't know that they really ever have paid attention. I think we romanticize the degree to which people ever paid attention to policy or ever really could converse about the intricacies of legislation and how much they knew about it. I think what's changed is that we're just in a completely new media environment, a new ecosystem, as some people call it. It's just a new world. But you know, and the way we talk may be a little bit different, but I think it's, you know, no less acrimonious than it's been over the last 200 years. It's just that there's just more of it, and it's easier to find it.
And it's easier to tune out and tune in. I mean, I've become someone who doesn't watch the Scream shows on cable vision anymore. I don't watch any of those shows. I'll go to those networks on the internet and sort of pick and choose, but everyone is screaming these days, and everyone was screaming before, but they're all screaming in the news media, and
they're screaming in HD.
And they're screaming in HD, and it's hard to find a sort of step back and balanced analysis because screaming at each other, you know, gets ratings. People have always screamed at each other, but it's all over everywhere, and people can be much more selective, and people are selecting the screams that they like and deselecting the they don't
It's
like.
interesting that you say that, because a few years ago, Jon Stewart went on Crossfire on CNN, now defunct Crossfire, and many people attribute the fact that that show is not on anymore because of his beatdown of Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala. But it doesn't seem to have, you know, abated the tide anywhere else.
No, because people want to watch those shows, right. And they get a you know, they don't get tens of millions, but they get a few million, enough to make them very profitable. They're low budget in a lot of ways. They don't produce any news content. They're talking heads. People who appear on them or people who come on for free or to sell their books. So they're very, you know, it's very inexpensive to produce these shows, and they do attract enough viewers to make them very profitable. And you see Fox and now MSNBC have really branded themselves so that if you're a Republican, you know where to watch. If you're a liberal, you know where to go to get your daily dose.
Let's get back to Louisiana for a second. As someone who follows Louisiana politics, it seems like there has been a decidedly lack of new faces over the past few years, but that may be changing with candidates like Carolyn Fayard coming out of nowhere. Who are some of the other up-and-coming political stars in the state from either party? Anybody you guys should be paying attention to?
I think on the Democratic side, I think Fayard is certainly someone to pay attention to. She really, literally came out of nowhere and has performed really well. And I think she'll be running, if she doesn't win this race for lieutenant governor, she'll be running for something else, Congress, or perhaps even governor. I ran into a friend the other day, a Republican friend, who was saying how thankful he was that she didn't run against Vitter, because he thought that there would be a good chance that she would have been much more competitive against Vitter. I think someone else to keep an eye on who is not really well known, but I think who's really impressed me a lot, is the House Democratic caucus leader, John Bell Edwards from the Florida parishes. Very, very smart, articulate, West Point graduate, attorney. His family has been in politics forever in that part of the state, and he's emerging as a real leader in the Democratic Party, and I'd keep my eye on him.
Anybody on the right side of the aisle?
Well, among Republicans, we actually have a lot of new faces. The entire congressional delegation is fairly new, and we're just now getting to know this fairly new congressional delegation. By fairly new, I mean the last 6 or 8 years. And so, and we're seeing Republican legislative leaders. We've never had that before. So I do think we're seeing a lot of new Republican faces in Louisiana because of the changes, you know, that have gone on politically in the state. So I think on the Republican side, almost everyone is new, and you know, a lot, especially in the legislature, in leadership positions. So I think you just look at the leadership in the House, and the Senate is governed by Democrats, but there are a lot of Republicans in leadership positions. So I think on the Republican side, you just look at all these people who are all of a sudden in positions of leadership, newer members of Congress, and the like.
Well, while talking about the state legislature, it's kind of hard to get out of here without talking a little bit about the budget crisis at LSU. And I just wanted to maybe ask both of you a slightly different question. First of all, Bob, what are your thoughts on LSU SGA President Jay Hudson calling out Governor Jindal for his travels during the budget crisis for higher education?
Well, I think it was a smart thing to do, and especially since the the student government leaders have tried to meet with the governor on numerous occasions and have been turned down. I mean, I think it was an act of sort of desperation, a very clever act of desperation, but it got the governor's attention. I thought it was interesting, though, that the governor, instead of saying, "Okay, I'll be back next Tuesday, and we'll set up a meeting," instead he chose to communicate with the students by posting something on his Facebook page in which they misspelled education.
They misspelled higher.
I'm sorry, they misspelled higher, it was. I thought it was an odd way to respond. That I'm out of state all the time. I don't have time to meet with you, and he sort of accentuates the separation between he and these students by only communicating with them by Facebook. I think my response would have been, why don't you hold your fundraisers on Facebook and your meetings in person instead of the other way around? I mean, your constituents and these students are really important. I personally, just from a political standpoint, I don't understand why the governor is not on this campus and on other campuses trying to explain to students why he's doing what he has to do. There's probably some good reasons that persuasive reasons that he can give. We might not agree with them, but if I were him, I would be engaging students instead of spurning them and insulting them by just communicating with them on Facebook.
Well, for as long as I remember, I mean, there's been student apathy on the LSU campus. I mean, it's been talked about many, many times. Well, that's not the case this time around. It seems like students are actually very engaged with this budget process.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is so different than, I've been here almost 30 years. This is so different because LSU has a lot to lose now. LSU has re-become a really strong university and is a really important engine for Louisiana's economy. It's one of these things that's one of the real bright shining lights in Louisiana that's going to take us forward. I know in the last 15 or 20 years, LSU has risen in the ratings. You can feel it on campus. Students are better. Programs have gotten better, and we're really becoming a flagship university outside of Louisiana. We're something that we can really be proud of, much more so. LSU's always been a good university, but it's becoming a great university again. It had its heyday back in the 30s and 40s, and it's really come back in the last 10 years. And I would hate in a year or so just the knees cut off. And that's what I think. Those of us who've been here a while, we've really been working hard to bring LSU to a place where it is now, and all of a sudden you feel like the knees are cut off after all that work. And I think that's why this is so different, because so many people out here have worked so hard to make this place what it is, and then, you know, in 6 months you're set back 20 years.
Well, guys, I certainly appreciate your service to LSU. You guys are great to have sat down and talked to us for a little while, and good luck in the future endeavors. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.